Welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we're going to talk about what it looks like in 2025 for Southeast Asia. How will the political events in the U.S. affect it? Our guest for the show is Carl Baker, Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum. Welcome, Carl.
Good to be here, Jay. Good to talk about Southeast Asia, sort of the beginning of my ventures overseas back in the early 1970s. So yeah, it's always a fun place to go back to, and it's an area that's actually become quite important in how the Indo-Pacific or the Asia Pacific actually does things these days, economically as well as in terms of security.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to become more important given, the troubles in Europe, actually, as a traveler destination. Anyway, we focus so much on the political events in the US and for that matter in Europe. We should also follow the events in Asia and Southeast Asia. So, my first question for you, and this is sort of the title question, how is it affected? How are the things in Southeast Asia affected by the Trump election and the tariffs and the expansionism that we see coming from Washington?
Well, I mean, Southeast Asia is affected, but Southeast Asia is also prepared. I think they have anticipated this happening. I think they learned from the first Trump administration that it's a very transactional administration, that it doesn't have great expectations for a lot of work with the United States, but it's also very prepared to balance the relationship between the United States and China, especially in terms of economics. When you look at what Southeast Asia and the United States used to have, it was very much a security oriented relationship, along with an expectation that the United States was sort of the market of last resort in terms of the economic relationship. But that's changed. And now Southeast Asia actually, I think, sees its security more around its existence as a multilateral collaboration called ASEAN, Association for Southeast Asian Nations. And I think that it sees it, especially its economic well-being, as very much tied up within ASEAN, but more increasingly its security relationship also. Because if you go back and look at how ASEAN was formed, it was really meant to prevent strategic rivalry in Southeast Asia from affecting the countries in Southeast Asia. And of course, this was back in the Cold War era in the late 60s when ASEAN was originally formed. But it was focused on the competition between the United States and Soviet Union. Now, with China becoming the new Soviet Union in this strategic competition with the United States, it very much sees the return to some of the roots of ASEAN. What happened is over the years, ASEAN became more focused on cooperative security, on building resilience within the area. But more and more, it's seeing itself as focused on ASEAN as a mechanism to prevent strategic rivalry from happening in geographic Southeast Asia.
Well, are you saying, and it sounds perfectly reasonable to say, that the Trump administration is bringing the countries in Southeast Asia closer, making ASEAN stronger, more collaborative? Is that happening?
Well, no, it's not happening in the sense that it's stronger. There are rifts in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, and some of them are being driven by what's happening with the Trump administration, because the first of all, it's not just the Trump administration. It's the Americans focused on strategic competition. So you can trace that back to the Trump administration with the trade war of the first administration. But certainly Biden's administration didn't reduce that tension in Southeast Asia. So it is broader than just the Trump administration. I think we need to appreciate that it is an American problem for Southeast Asia. And Trump is probably only going to exacerbate it because of his unpredictability, of his very transactional attitude toward everything that happens. So certainly they're concerned economically with Trump, but more broadly, they're concerned about what's happening with the strategic competition between the US and China specifically.
Well, on that point, the second part of my question is, does the Trump administration and what it does and threatens to do, does that bring the countries or some of the countries in ASEAN closer to China?
Well, I think what America has done over the last, let's say, 10 years has brought them closer to China, because the United States has failed to develop a meaningful economic relationship in Southeast Asia, while China has. And so nowadays, Southeast Asians rely on China as the primary engine for economic development. And that is central to all Southeast Asia countries. Part of it is because of the post-colonial mindset. Part of it is because they are developing economies. They're very focused on the economic relationship. They don't see each other as being military rivals or as security threats. So what they're focused on is economy. And what the Chinese have done is very skillfully and very methodically developed strong economic relationships with Southeast Asia. So what you have today in Southeast Asia is all the countries are dependent on the economic relationship with China. But what's happening is, with recent developments, again, we'll start in the old Trump administration, although they were probably there uh, they were latently in the relationship well before that. But clearly what's happened in the last couple of years, as the strategic rivalry between the United States and China has increased, is they've made a choice that they have to think about China as a security partner, as well as the United States as the security partner. So they've lost the mindset that the United States is the security guarantor, and that they have to really develop their own security mechanisms. So that I think is sort of fundamental. But also, you have to appreciate how diverse Southeast Asia really is. You have two very strongly Muslim countries. You have in Malaysia and Indonesia, and Brunei for that matter. And then you have a very Christian country in the Philippines, and a country, the Philippines, of course, that is very closely tied to the United States, much closer than all the other countries. And then on the mainland, you have Buddhist countries, and then communist countries overlaid that Buddhist religion. And so it makes a very, very diverse group of countries that actually call themselves somehow united in building a security community in Southeast Asia. So in recent years, what's happened, especially in Malaysia and Indonesia, is there is a lot of animosity being felt toward Israel and the American support for Israel, to the point where Indonesia and Malaysia have made very strong statements about their dislike for what the United States has done, the hypocrisy associated with them sanctioning Russia for what's happened in Ukraine, and then turning what they see as a blind eye to what the United States has done in Israel in basically killing Palestinians. And so it's a very strong sentiment, both in Malaysia and in Indonesia. And I think that that's driving their concerns with what's happening in the United States. And certainly the Trump administration isn't going to reduce that concern. But it's also driving disagreements between the countries themselves. So now you have the Philippines, which is very closely aligned with the United States. And the others are saying, Philippines, you need to be careful here, because you're sort of violating the trust between the ASEAN states with getting too close to the United States. So there's a rift there. And then, of course, also you have Vietnam and Cambodia, Laos, who see China as vital to their economic security. And so they're moving away a little bit from the United States as well, saying, we really need to maintain that economic relationship, and we'll take advantage of the United States when and where we can. But we certainly want to maintain the relationship with China.
Well, so it's a move away from the United States. Maybe it didn't start with the Trump administration, but I wonder your thoughts about whether this is reversible, whether there's anything that the Trump administration could or would or might do to bring us closer to Southeast Asia, or is that really not likely?
I don't think it's very likely with the Trump administration, simply because Southeast Asia's approach is going to be to try to take advantage, any advantage they can get from the economic relationship with the United States. And I don't see that as being real great. The only area where I think there's going to be some interesting developments is how the United States treats China. And I mean, and that is the big question for Southeast Asia, is what happens to that US-China relationship? Is Trump going to strike a deal? And then what happens with the relationship between Southeast Asia and China if the grand bargain is struck between the United States and China? Or is the United States going to try to offshore and move manufacturing into Southeast Asia? Right now, that's sort of the common perspective from Southeast Asia, is that they see an opportunity to take advantage of companies moving out of China to build factories and capacity in Southeast Asia. So certainly a country like Vietnam sees that to their advantage, and they'll try to take advantage of that to the extent they can while maintaining the relationship with China. And I think Malaysia, Indonesia are much the same. Cambodia, Laos are small enough that they probably don't matter. The key countries really are Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam.
I wonder how China feels about moving manufacturing, outsourcing what it used to manufacture itself to Southeast Asia and all these countries who would love to have the work, but that kind of flies in the face of China's current economic issues.
No, well, in fact, the Chinese companies are the ones who are probably doing as much as anybody in building capacity in Southeast Asia, because they see that as their avenue to maintaining access to the United States if the Trump administration takes the approach that China fears, and that is that it tries to close out China even more. It's already setting up these manufacturing facilities in Southeast Asia to basically circumvent the tariffs that they anticipate coming from the Trump administration. So they're very much a part of the economic game being played in Southeast Asia, that they also are trying to move offshore from China into Southeast Asia. First, actually, the labor is now cheaper in Southeast Asia in some cases than it is in China. So they see that as not detrimental to their economic well-being.
You mentioned that Southeast Asia is watching the relationship between China and the US, but that involves watching the relationship between China and the US vis-a-vis Taiwan. How important is the dynamic about Taiwan to the reactions of Southeast Asia?
Let's talk about the Philippines first, because I think it is sort of an outlier in Southeast Asia at this point. As closely as they've tried to align with the United States, as much as they've tried to get the United States to support their claims in the South China Sea, they've actually moved away from ASEAN. And so they are very much thinking about how do they support a US contingency in Taiwan. And there's the development that occurred several years ago now is they've expanded what's called the EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement between the United States and the Philippines, where there's now 9 bases in the Philippines where the United States can rotate troops, maintain war material, in the name of both disaster relief and in the potential for military conflict. So you have the Philippines in that situation, and then the rest of Southeast Asia is, again, this is where they're saying to the Philippines, you better be careful, because we're not necessarily looking to support Taiwan. In fact, we had an interesting meeting almost 2 years ago now, where we were talking about what's happening in Southeast Asia and in the context of U.S.-China rivalry. And one of the things that you have in Taiwan is large numbers of Indonesians and Thais and Vietnamese who are working as laborers in Taiwan. And so the concern, of course, is what do you do when you have a war in Taiwan and you have to evacuate all these people? And in the context of that conversation, the Filipino participants were saying, well, you're going to have to look at moving people from Taiwan through the Philippines to get them back home to Indonesia and Vietnam. And one of the Indonesian participants said, well, why? We could bring them back through Shanghai. We don't need to go through the Philippines. And that was just sort of an eye opener that the rest of Southeast Asia doesn't see it as a binary relationship. They see, well, we have relations with China. If we really want to bring our people home from Taiwan, why wouldn't we just bring them in through China? Because we know that we can rely on them as a partner to do that. So I think that sort of epitomizes what's really happening in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is completely prepared to play both sides to their advantage. And that's again, we go back to the origins of ASEAN. That was the basis for what they were trying to do at the time, was trying to prevent conflict in Southeast Asia, and they were prepared to work both sides to achieve that goal.
Carl, aside from the threat of tariffs, we have the implications of Trump's expansionism. I mean, he's got three countries, and if you look at, for example, Colombia, maybe more than three countries where he is pushing them and being an expansionist, manifest destiny, global manifest destiny. How does that affect, if at all, the thinking of people in Southeast Asia?
I mean, I don't want to speak for people in Southeast Asia, but I will. I think, I mean, in my view, I think Southeast Asia sees it more as a resurrection of the Monroe Doctrine. This is really Trump trying to expand his influence in the Americas, in that part of the world, and it sees it as something that they expect, and in some ways a recognition that the defense secretary doesn't know any ASEAN countries, because they are very skeptical about the words that come out of Americans' mouths when they say, we understand that ASEAN centrality is important and we need to shift to the Indo-Pacific. They don't believe it, quite frankly. They understand what they mean when they say ASEAN centrality, and it means that everybody should be looking to ASEAN as the cornerstone for setting agendas in Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific security. And they don't believe that the United States is committed to that mindset. They believe that the United States is committed to its own national interests, and it will take advantage of whatever it can in Southeast Asia. But it doesn't believe that it has the respect of the Americans in Southeast Asia. And this goes to the thing that always comes up about the Americans not showing up for ASEAN related meetings in Southeast Asia. This is they're very sensitive to these kinds of things, that ASEAN, and understand that ASEAN is the core of 10 countries in Southeast Asia. But what they've done in the context of their talk about ASEAN centrality is they've blossomed this out to have now a whole number of organizations. And this is where people like Pete Hegseth get confused, because there's ASEAN, and then there's ASEAN Plus, and then there's ASEAN Regional Forum, and there's East Asia Summit, and there's all kinds of organizational structures that the 10 ASEAN countries have built to try to be inclusive, to bring people together around the idea of ASEAN, which is to build a security community, to talk about security issues. So the United States is part of the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is a foreign ministers forum to talk about security issues. And then there's the East Asia Summit, which is a leaders meeting, which, if you remember, this was the meeting that Trump went to the Philippines and then walked out before the meeting actually happened. And, and for that matter, Biden failed to show up at the East Asia Summit and sent the foreign minister. But these sent very strong signals to Southeast Asia that while we mouth the words about ASEAN centrality, we don't really believe it. We because we continue to do these things, and they're very sensitive to it. Partly is certainly the colonial heritage in Southeast Asia, but also it's partly ASEAN's concern that they don't want to get involved with great power rivalry in their part of the world.
P.S. I don't believe it either. But let's go to Ukraine. Ukraine is an example of the U.S. Not really following through on its assurances of defending Ukraine. Trump is an example of that right now. And so what it says is that the U.S. really is not a good security partner for NATO, the EU, for Ukraine. And I wonder how that affects the thinking of the countries of Southeast Asia, the officials of Southeast Asia, in terms of relying on the United States as a security partner who will stick with it.
Well, yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, in Southeast Asia, you have Vietnam, and I mean that is a story about security, about the United States' commitment to a security relationship in itself. But again, this is going back to what I was talking about earlier, is the Philippines is really the only country that has really gone full on, we're going to go with the United States, and the others have basically been warning the Philippines, your guys are going too far. You're straying away from ASEAN, you're straying away from ASEAN centrality and trying to get too close to the United States. And this creates a lot of discomfort in Southeast Asia. Even Singapore, which is considered a security partner for the United States, has always been very careful to maintain that economic relationship with China, even though they allow they're much more willing to allow the United States to bring in ships to the ports and all that. But even Singapore is warning the Philippines, saying don't go too far here, and then yeah, the other countries are certainly the same way. But again, Ukraine, yeah, they see Ukraine as yet another example. But again, their touch point is always going to be, look what happened in Vietnam.
So now we have this fairly remarkable event where Indonesia joins BRICS.
Well, it's BRICS plus now, because you have the BRICS, the original five, plus you have Egypt, Indonesia, as you said, is joined, and Iran is now part of it. I think I can't remember. They just add Egypt, Iran. They just added five more countries, and so so now Indonesia is the first Southeast Asia country that joined. But also, as Indonesia joined, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand are all observers or partners at this point. So BRICS has very much become sort of the global South's response to Western dominance of the financial system. And so Indonesia, yeah, the biggest country in Southeast Asia. Don't forget, Indonesia has 277 million people. So it's almost the size of the United States, has thrown in its lot with BRICS. And Malaysia is not far behind. And there's been a lot of argument out of Malaysia that they really want to join because they see this as a way to mitigate influence of the United States. And a lot of that in Malaysia specifically is driven by what's happened, not in so much Ukraine, but in Israel, in Gaza.
And you think there might be other countries? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah. I mean, Vietnam and Thailand are not joining just yet, but they certainly have shown interest in joining BRICS. And so, as I said, they're partner countries now. And so, yeah, I think both, especially Putin, sees the BRICS as a way to move away from dollar domination the financial transactions in local currencies, BRICS becomes an avenue to promote that. I don't think BRICS isn't going to be able to provide a full alternative to the Western dominance of the financial markets, but it certainly is a place to look for resistance to the American dominance.
Well, every time one of those Southeast Asian countries joins BRICS, it's a black eye for the U.S., right?
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's the whole point. It's not so much that they actually provide any coherent, manageable structure. It's that we're joining BRICS, and it's almost in the negative sense that we're joining BRICS just to show the United States that we can. It's not that BRICS offers anything particularly bright. They're working on a financial collaboration. They're trying to, bring more trade into the local currencies, and they're trying to develop a BRICS-based banking system, investment banking system. But they're a long ways from being able to do that. So you have people in the West who are saying, yeah, they're talking, but they haven't really been able to develop any kind of governance mechanisms yet. And eventually diversity, the argument is that eventually diversity will destroy BRICS, just like it's destroyed other global and international financial systems.
Well, let's pull India out of BRICS for a minute and talk about it separately. I mean, it is huge. Its economy is huge. Its influence is huge. What is its relationship with countries in Southeast Asia?
India has had a fairly long-standing relationship. It had a look east policy for about 20 years, and looking east means looking at Southeast Asia as a trade partner. It's probably been less successful than they have hoped. That now they talk about not look east, but go east and do east, or something along those lines, trying to develop a relationship with the countries. But it's been pretty slow for them. Recently in the news, they've been able to sell their BrahMos missile defense system to the Philippines. And so that's or missile system, I shouldn't say missile defense system, missile system to the Philippines. And that was big news. They've had some security collaboration with Vietnam and have shown support for maritime security more broadly with some of the Southeast Asia countries. But India, for Southeast Asia, India has not become an important economic partner. They've been somewhat involved with Myanmar, with the Myanmar crisis, but even that's somewhat limited. India really hasn't been a big factor in Southeast Asia. I don't think as big as they could have been, as big as they are, and as important as they are as an offset to China. But India, of course, has always taken it's very much a wants to maintain its position as the leader of the non-aligned movement, and so in that sense, they've been reluctant to work with Southeast Asia to counter China, but they recognize that there's some value in it. And so like I said, they've worked with Vietnam, they've worked to some extent with Indonesia, but certainly not as much as you would expect.
Well, let's talk about the economies of Southeast Asia. If they really got together, it would be a huge collaborative economy, but they haven't quite done that. And they're fighting with climate change. I mean, think of what climate change has done and will do to some of the low-lying countries in Southeast Asia. And I wonder, how their economies are doing, and how the possibility of more collaboration among them on economic matters is doing. I wonder how they're affected by advances and changes in technology and social media as a communications form, and AI as a high octane technology. I mean, are they keeping up with the Western world, or is climate change undermining their possibilities?
No, I think Southeast Asia is keeping up. Southeast Asia, just as a point of reference, there's 675 million people in Southeast Asia in all the 10 countries. the GDP 3.8 trillion, which what comes in about fifth in the world. So it's a sizable economy, 3.8 trillion. Internal 21% of its trade is done internally in ASEAN, 16% with China, 14% with the United States. So, it is a significant economy, and it's worked very hard at economic integration. One of the way ASEAN is structured is you have three communities. You have the economic community, the security community, and the social cultural community. And the economic community has certainly done more to integrate itself, and that's reflected in the trade numbers that you see, and it's they are the focal point for the regional comprehensive economic partnership, which China is part of, but that's ASEAN's economic partnership, and they've got a trade agreement with China. Several of them are part of the comprehensive progressive Trans-Pacific partnership in terms of the economic structures. So they've done a lot with economic integration in Southeast Asia. And so as a unit, I think Southeast Asia economy is fairly strong. And yeah, they have a climate change problem. They have a huge problem. There's a huge amount of pollution in Southeast Asia. One of the aspects of the Indo-Pacific economic framework that the United States was pushing, that they were most interested in, was of course this green technology, which if we can base our assessment on what's happened in the last week, I would say that that's probably in trouble, as one of the reasons the Trump administration froze all foreign assistance is to eliminate any talk about green technology. And that's going to affect Southeast Asia very directly. So this is going to push them even more toward China, which raises the issue of electric vehicles. China is pushing electric vehicles in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia has jumped on that bandwagon. When you go to the cities in Southeast Asia today, you see Chinese EVs on the street. So that certainly is the case. In terms of digital economy, in some ways, Southeast Asia has leapfrogged the United States, because it really didn't have a strong financial system. And so in any number of countries in Southeast Asia, the only way you can pay for stuff is with a credit card, or your phone, because they simply have moved to that technology. So fintech in Southeast Asia is a thing. And digital economy is a very important part of Southeast Asia. They've worked very hard at a digital trade agreement in Southeast Asia to ensure that they have insulated themselves against outside influences. So no, Southeast Asia is much more high tech than you might expect, given the state of some of the lower ranked economies. Now, again, it's a huge variation in the economies in Southeast Asia. You have Singapore, which is in some ways equivalent to Japan in terms of modern infrastructure and capacity. And then you have in sort of the next tier, you have Thailand and Malaysia as fairly strong economies, and increasingly Vietnam and Indonesia and Philippines. And then you have the rest, and that Cambodia, Laos, and Brunei is sort of a weird example, as it's really just a sultanate of 500,000 people. So and then Myanmar, of course, is the certainly the one that's left behind one at a time because of what's happening with the junta and resistance and all that.
Yeah, well, that raises a question to me about internal security and personal safety and law and order, crime and punishment, that sort of thing. The rule of law, if you will, especially around personal security. I mean, I think there are people in the U.S. that are packing their go bags, and they don't know where to go. And some people have told me they want to go to Southeast Asia because they think the prices are good there. and it's a secure place. But is it really? Myanmar doesn't sound very secure. Myanmar is, unstable. Would you say? What is the level of security and stability?
I mean, in the rest of South, let's not talk about Myanmar just yet, but the rest of Southeast Asia is a very secure place. I mean, you don't really have a security threat in certainly in the cities in those places. I mean, there's some residual radical Islamist groups in Indonesia and southern Thailand and maybe some of those rural areas. But for the most part, I mean, if you go to Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur or Bangkok, uh, those are and even Phnom Penh in Cambodia or Vientiane, if they I mean, Vientiane is sort of a little dusty cow town in some ways. But I mean, those cities are fairly safe, and there is law and order, and and you don't have militias running around with rifles like you see in Manila, but so those places I think are actually quite safe in terms of personal security. Manila is a little bit different. They have they have a bit of a gun culture that makes it feel intimidating when you walk around and see guards at the entrance of the hotel with shotguns and things like that. But you know, and then Myanmar, yeah, I mean Myanmar right now is in crisis. There's you once you get away from Yangon, the major city, there's really disputed disputed governance in the rest of the country. I mean, there's areas that are controlled by the resistance forces, and where the government is in control, it's a fairly violent place to live because you have conflicts that break out in the streets. So I wouldn't recommend going to Myanmar, but every place else in Southeast Asia, I think, as far as personal security, it's quite secure. Now, yeah, and as far as rule of law, one of the odd things about Southeast Asia is there's always been this tendency to elect strongmen populists as the government in the democratic states. Vietnam and Laos are exceptions because there isn't really elections, but the places where there are elections, they tend to elect strong men leaders, and that I mean there is the advantage of that is that there is a strong police force, and there isn't a lot of open crime on the streets that you are affected by if you're a citizen living there.
No, a related area is the relations and travel between the countries of Southeast Asia. In my cursory reading in this, I found that there was an initiative in some places in Southeast Asia to allow visa-free travel. You could go from one country to another without a visa, which is always refreshing.
Yeah.
That's, a sign of enlightenment. Is that happening? Will it happen? Will
Oh,
there be visa-free travel between the U.S. and these various countries?
there is visa-free travel among the 10. There's no real restrictions to move around in Southeast Asia. For the United States, I mean, nowadays everybody has gone to this electronic pre-registering, and so you have to send in your electronic uh, permission slip to go into most of the countries. But the only place in Southeast Asia that require actual visas are Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and that's it. And then those are you send away $25 and get your visa in 3 days. It's you get your visa ahead of time, and then you just present it at the counter. So it's fairly easy to travel to Southeast Asia for Americans as well as most people. And in fact, what's happening now in Southeast Asia is they're encouraging visa-free travel, even for like Indians, which are typically it's very difficult to get in for Indians, but they've even opened the visa gates, the floodgates for Indian tourists in places like Thailand, just trying to build the tourism industry. And tourism is a big thing for several countries in Southeast Asia, specifically Thailand is very heavily dependent on tourism, but also Malaysia and to some extent Cambodia and Laos for some of the some of the traditional historic sites that they have in those countries.
Yeah, I know people in Honolulu who go to Southeast Asia every time they get a chance, and they invest in charitable ventures in Southeast Asia, like orphanages and libraries and the like.
Yeah.
So they're very interested in in contributing to Southeast Asia. You think that'll
Yeah, and
continue?
yeah. I mean, Southeast Asia is ultimately a very welcoming place. I mean, they don't mind the tourists. They're perfectly willing to accept some of the obnoxious behavior that tourists bring. And well, I mean, when you look at what's happened in Japan and some of Europe, where they're trying to figure out how to get control of the tourists, I've never really seen that in Southeast Asia. That they're like I say, very welcoming, and they've organized things that sort of minimize the impact of tourism, but they certainly encourage tourism. I can't think
Well,
of any place that discourages it other than maybe these days Myanmar.
Carl, we're getting to the end of our discussion here today, but I have one last and very challenging question for you. It's a hypothetical. It's a case study. Okay, let's suppose that tomorrow morning you get a call from Washington, and it's the State Department. It's Marco Rubio's office, and they're saying, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, doesn't feel he knows enough about Southeast Asia, and he wants to formulate policy, maybe new policy, better policy for the United States and Southeast Asia. And we would like your advice, Carl. We would like to know what you suggest that policy should be. What is your answer?
Go back to the ASEAN way, and the ASEAN way is consultation leads to consensus, non-interference in others' affairs, peaceful resolution of conflict, inclusivity, informality, and organizational minimization, minimal organization. And I think that is what you need to do when you think about Southeast Asia. Is they did when the United States came out with their Indo-Pacific framework, security framework. The first thing ASEAN did was they put together an ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific framework. And what they said is, yeah, this is all fine, but we think you need to be inclusive. And this goes back to the whole idea of ASEAN centrality. They want to build their vision is we want to build a security community. And the way you build a security community, which makes it attractive, is that you build it from the bottom up. You don't build it like the European Union, where you put all these rules out there and expect people to follow the rules. You build a community that's comfortable at a comfortable pace for all, and you accept that this is going to be a slow grinding process, but it takes time to build a security community. And so don't think you're going to come in and make rules and people are going to follow them. They're going to follow the rules because they want to follow the rules, because they see some advantage to following those rules, not because you said follow those rules. It's because they see it to their advantage, and you have to convince them that it's to their advantage. You're not going to convince them just because somebody said so. And I think that's where you come to the idea of, do you have respect out of admiration or respect out of fear? And what I see nowadays for the countries in Southeast Asia is they look at the United States and yeah, they fear what Trump might do in terms of tariffs. And they fear what the United States might do in terms of cutting people off because they don't like them or because they said something to offend them. But they see respect out of admiration as what they would really like. And that's why I think they get so offended when the Americans don't show up at the ASEAN meetings. And so my advice to Mr. Rubio would be patient and accept them for who they are and give them agency in providing your security framework in Southeast Asia, because that's what they want. They want to say, yes, we feel like we're partners, not subjects. And this goes back to the old colonial mindset that many of them fear, many of them still resent in Southeast Asia. So I think that's the message that needs to be delivered. We don't need your nuclear umbrella. We don't need your ships coming through telling us that you're providing security to us. What we need is you to give us agency in promoting our own security through our vision of security, not your vision.
Much good advice, Carl. Although I have to say, it doesn't seem likely if that conversation took place that they would accept your advice. I'm sorry.
No, I don't think so either. I mean, I no, and I think Southeast Asia knows that. And that's why they're
Yeah.
looking there. That's why they look for alternatives. That's why they look for other like-minded countries. And by that, I mean like-minded countries who see value in multilateralism and who promote the idea of a much more benign centrality, not the centrality of you, I tell you what to do and then you do it. It's let's work together to find ways to do things that are beneficial to everybody. And
Agreed.
that's why today I think Southeast Asia looks at China and they see them as much more benign than the United States, because that's the narrative China is promoting in Southeast Asia, and it resonates with the Southeast Asians. Even though they fear China in some ways, just like everybody does, but they also feel more of a bond with China in the sense that they see them as the narrative as much more mutually beneficial.
Okay, Carl. We'll have to leave it there. Carl Baker, Senior Advisor for Pacific Forum. Thank you so much, Carl. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Thank you to our viewers for watching and our listeners for listening. We'll see you again soon for the next show. Aloha.